I'm Tony Condor and I'm a talking guide for the Civic Trust in Gloucester. This is a talk about Gloucester's railway history done for the Railway Day at the Folk Museum, the Folk, which the Civic Trust now run. So Gloucester's railway history is surprisingly national in outlook because decisions were made in Gloucester that would affect the railways all over the country. Gloucester was quite early on into the railways. Birmingham had a station in 1837. Gloucester had been looking at tramways, and the first railway would arrive in Gloucester in 1840, opening up through to Birmingham in 1841, and that was the Birmingham-Gloucester Railway. Standard gauge, 4 foot 8.5, what you see between the tracks when you go to look at them today. Gloucester would become the centre of a railway cross. The next rails would come from Bristol. These were under Isambard Kingdom Brunel, so they are his 7 foot wide gauge, what we call the broad gauge. So in Gloucester, 7 foot rails met 4 foot 8 rails. That was 1844. 1845, after much discussion, the rails from London arrived in Gloucester down the Stroud Valley, again 7 foot wide. And in 1851, through the forest from South Wales, linking eventually the Fishguard ferry with Ireland through to London. The 3 bottom lines are all broad gauge, the top one standard gauge. Of course, from that early crosser railways, Gloucestershire would develop a whole railway network, linking into the valleys around Dursley, linking through the forest with coal and mineral traffic, and more sparsely up into the Cotswolds and then passenger services developing. But it's Gloucester we're going to look at mostly today. It's difficult when you look at Gloucester now to think just how much there was in terms of railway infrastructure. This is the view into the city over the top of the Great Western Railway sheds, roughly from the hospital site in Gloucester today, looking into the heart of the city. Eastgate station on the left, the Great Western station on the right. But it all started much more simply with the tramway arriving from Cheltenham and opening up in about 1811, crossing Horton Road here and making its way past the park and down to the docks. Cheltenham desperately needed more coal. The town was growing fast and they needed the coal supplies that could be brought in by the River Severn to Gloucester. So the tramway made its way across country, and not so long ago you could still climb the gasometer on Horton Road near the hospital and look down at Horton Road, and this is the old line of the tramway coming across Horton Road and then going away into Gloucester, and it wound its way through, and you can still find traces of it. Behind Brunswick Square you've got very handily named Old Tramway Road, and you can follow that route through into the docks themselves. And up till 1860 or so you'd still have had traces down by the side of the river where the lock into the dock was. Well, the lock's still there, but the tramway's gone, coming down Commercial Road and down to the old quayside at Gloucester. The tramway disappeared in the 1860s because the railway had come and most of what it was used for, its use disappeared. The tramways had been looked at throughout the 1820s and 1830s. There was one glorious suggestion that a tramway from the River Avon at Bristol would come all the way up through Gloucester and head for Birmingham. You can imagine the poor old horse faced with that journey. It's not so good. In the 1830s they began to look at plans for steam railways to link Gloucester through to Birmingham, and the first person on the scene was Isambard Kingdom Brunel. A lazy day at the office, went to sleep after lunch and drew a line like that across the paper up through Evesham. But that was the easiest route to get from Gloucester to Birmingham. It was the least uphill route. Still had to get to the top. That was rejected, and essentially the people looking to pay for a line between Birmingham and Gloucester said, find us the cheapest land, build us a route that costs as little as possible. Other people said, well heavens, we've got all these towns and cities down through the Severn corridor, let's build lines that link up Worcester and Kidderminster and various other places and bring that down. No, the company of proprietors up in Birmingham said, no, we want to go directly to Gloucester. The idea is we're going to reach the docks. The docks have opened in 1827. We want to bring freight traffic down into Gloucester. So that dark black line through the map is the line that was produced. And it gets complicated between Cheltenham and Gloucester, it always does. At Cheltenham, there were a couple of other lines proposed, one of them being the line that looks like barbed wire through here, Cheltenham and Great Western Union line through to London. Again engineered by Brunel, who'd persuaded the proprietors that the best way to do that was to go south from Gloucester and up through the Stroud valleys, because that's the only way he could see steam engines getting up to the top of the Cotswolds. What Parliament said, faced with two Acts of Parliament, one a line from Birmingham to Gloucester and the other the line from Cheltenham to London, was where they overlapped at the bottom, whoever got their Act of Parliament first was the one that would be built. And it was the Cheltenham and Great Western Union that got their act through first. Now they weren't interested in Gloucester docks and freight, so the whole purpose of the first line was put to one side by the Parliamentary Act, who said, no, you've got to agree on the route between Cheltenham and Gloucester and it'll be that line. So they pushed the original idea for the line to Gloucester and attached it to the Cheltenham line, moved it as far into the centre of Cheltenham as they could afford to build a railway station, and then came through to a station in Gloucester and then on south, which produced all the complications which we still have in Gloucester today of trains from the north going south. If they're coming to Gloucester, they have to come in and go back out again. So a simple Act of Parliament caused a real complication in Gloucester. The line north of Cheltenham went through the cheapest land, and then they found themselves having to climb the Lickey Incline. The Lickey Incline is 1 in 37 in old money, which is as steep as a railway gets on the main line. And yes, it might have been cheap to buy, but it gave them a real headache in terms of what motive power they could actually use to get up it. At the time, most railway locomotives were simple four-wheel things, quite capable of handling a decent tonnage of passengers, but faced with that climb up the hill, the company said to the railway manufacturers, what can you produce that will definitely get up that hill? And with the demands on their capacity at the time, they weren't particularly bothered about talking to a little company from Gloucester to Birmingham. And it was by chance, apparently, that the representative of a Philadelphia engine builder came into the company offices and said, oh gee, yes, we can build those, we've got hills like that in America, we're going up and down them all the time. And on the back of a fag packet drew them a plan for the railway locomotive. They hadn't actually built it in America at the time it was sold to us in Gloucester, but there we are. And it's one of the first cases where Britain actually went and bought stuff from America and had it brought back across the Atlantic rather than stuff going in the opposite direction. They did build the locomotive. The English engineers said, well, they're cheating really. They've put all the weight on one big wheel at the back so you get great grip to drive it up the hill. And by the way, they tighten up the safety valve so they can get even greater pressure in the boiler. But it might blow up. Anyway, it worked, and the trains began to steam up the Lickey Incline in the 1840s, linking Gloucester through to Birmingham. So the line opens into Gloucester, crosses Horton Road, roughly where the tramway crossed, and the station in Gloucester, the first station, was built roughly in the car park of the existing railway station, opposite the land registry. It was a very simple station, not the great porticoed things that you see at the London and the Birmingham stations. This is it taken in much later in life, when it's certainly even more humble. But behind that were the train sheds that the standard gauge locos and carriages came into. Because the Birmingham to Gloucester Company had thought that they'd be linking up to the docks, they had actually also started down on the canal side, and they'd built a huge dock for themselves, and beside it they'd built plants for making coke out of coal. The coal would come in from South Wales, and they would turn that into coke, because the early railway locomotives worked off coke as a fuel. But because they lost out in Parliament, the freight lines down to it never got built. And they used to have wonderful shareholders meetings where people would say, right, well, you appear to be wasting loads of money down in here. You've built a dock, it's filling up with mud. What's happening to it? You've wasted £20,000 of the shareholders' money building this dock. Whereupon the company's only reaction was to say, point of order, it's not £20,000, it's £14,000, which was a heck of a lot of money in those days. And it would take quite a long time to unscramble the problem that Parliament had caused. Finally, in 1844, the line from Bristol arrived, crossed over the standard gauge right on the road crossing at Horton Road, and the two lines came together in the railway station. Great opening day. Huge long train steamed up from Bristol with the Lord Mayor of Bristol on it to have lunch with the Mayor of Gloucester and everything. As it went round the curve there, it fell off the tracks. The track wasn't up to it, and all the dignitaries from Bristol had to get off their carriages, walk round the rest of it and sit down to have lunch, while Isambard King de Brunel, who was on the train, took off his hat and had to help get everything back on the track so that the return journey to Bristol could be made. The obvious problem was that here you've got trains travelling on a 7-foot wide track, and here you've got trains travelling on a 4'8" track. So everybody had to change trains. And this was something that began to upset people, and they began to talk about it. But before that was resolved, the actual companies had a lot to think about. The line from Bristol to Birmingham became one company. The two separate companies, north and south of Gloucester, joined up, became one company, even though they'd got different sized tracks, and they decided that they would sell themselves either to the Great Western Railway or the Midland Railway. Great Western they favoured. And this is, again, part of Gloucester's history within the railways. Had they been successful in selling themselves to the Great Western would probably have made a broad gauge track north of Gloucester up to Birmingham, and the whole history of the 7-foot wide railway could have been different. But as we'll see, they didn't. So Edmund Sturge, one of three brothers, great family doing business in the docks in Birmingham, corn factors and all sorts of other things, were members, the Sturge brothers were members of the railway company. And they were trying to sell themselves to the Great Western. Charles Saunders was the secretary. The Great Western had rather overextended themselves. They didn't have an awful lot of money. And so they told the Gloucester people, basically, this is our deal, take it or leave it. Gloucester people didn't like it, so they went back, had another think about it, and they were travelling up to London. Sturge and a fellow director, they got on a train at Rugby to get to London because that's where they'd been at the time, and discussing how they were going to approach the Great Western Railway people. In the carriage, suddenly a man in the corner of the carriage spoke up, and he said, well, if you don't get satisfaction, gentlemen, from the Great Western Railway, I will buy your line. And who are you, sir? Well, we are the Midland Railway. And it seems coincidentally that this man was sitting in the carriage. That's how the story goes anyway. And that would be John Ellis, who was director of the Midland. And when they were unsuccessful in the negotiations with Charles Saunders, the line from Bristol up to Birmingham was sold to the Midland, and that would make it eventually become Fulford 8.5 and bring it into the standardised railway system. When you think of several people in a railway carriage and the sort of voice from the corner, actually Sturge and the Midland Railway were quite well connected. This is a picture from 1840 of one of the great anti-slavery meetings in London, and here is Ellis and here are the Sturge brothers. They were all in the anti-slavery movement. They must have known one and they must have talked, so perhaps that was a put-up story to save the Great Western's face. So now we have the Great Western, we have the two lines, one from Bristol, one from Birmingham, meeting at Gloucester railway station. And this view of Queen Victoria changing trains at Gloucester gives you an idea of what the railway station actually looked like. There wouldn't have been a grandstand of people watching every time. That was put on specially. She's changing trains onto the broad gauge, and she's come down the west coast of the country because there's a cholera outbreak in London at the time, and she's travelling from Scotland to the Isle of Wight, and she doesn't want to catch cholera, so she's come through Gloucester. But it shows you she and everybody else had to change from one gauge, the standard gauge, to the broad gauge at Gloucester. And it became the butt of jokes in Punch. You can imagine the problems of travelling in Victorian times with actually changing trains. The wonderful dresses that people wore, how they crammed those into the railway carriages, I've no idea. The number of people travelling, and of course you also had the time factor, and the Great Western gradually took on London time and it became railway time. So you get a clock at Bristol with 3 hands because there's 9 minutes difference between what time the train will leave and what time you're actually working on. So Bristol is 9 minutes after London. It's bad enough reading a railway timetable at the best of times, let alone with the added problem of trying to work out what the time difference is. Add that onto the fact that you've got everybody getting off one train wanting to get on another one if they're not actually getting off in Gloucester. And the Illustrated London News drew this amazing picture of what people travelled with and how they travelled from one train to the other. And it caused chaos and began to get people actually noticing what was going on in Gloucester. Punch developed a phrase, lost at Gloucester. If you've lost something, you'd say, oh, I must have lost it at Gloucester, changing from one train to the other. This is the proud husband. Have you got all the small parcels, my wife said to me. Yes, I said, 23 in all. Then she said to me, give me the baby. I said to her, what? Haven't you got him? We lost the baby at Gloucester. Shocking. And people began to talk about it in London, and people began to say, how can we let people build a railway system around the country that's 4 foot 8 in one place and 7 foot in another, and what happens when they all join up, and shouldn't we actually do something about it? Parliament at the time was quite happy to sit back, make sure that railway companies were pretty well financially successful, but they hadn't really thought about the mechanics of a system developing right across the country. And they finally decided that they would send a delegation down to Gloucester in 1845, led by the Astronomer Royal. I suppose he was the only engineer they could find who wasn't involved in railways at the time. And they came down to look at what happened in Gloucester when people changed from one train to another. Mr. Payne, who was the freight superintendent, organised 3 trains to be unpacked and scattered across the goods yard, just to make it look even more chaotic than it actually was, because the Midland were determined that Parliament would come down and say the 4 foot 8.5 gauge is the one that the country must have, and get rid of the 7 foot Isambard Kingdom Brunel gauge. It was pretty much a given anyway, given that there were about 2,000 miles of 4 foot 8 gauge and only about 200 miles of the 7 foot wide gauge. Parliament decided, and they decided they would standardise on the 4 foot 8 gauge in the United Kingdom, and they would standardise on the 5 foot 3 gauge within Ireland, which isn't quite standardisation within the British Isles, but Parliament knows best, no doubt. It wasn't just passengers, it wasn't just freight. There were horses and things like that travelling, which also had to be shifted from one train to another. It must have been a chaotic day's work at Gloucester when you had the 2 gauges operating side by side. I always like to think of your Victorian, say, an articled clerk coming down to look at the estate management of somewhere, arrives at Gloucester and looks for a coach or a carriage to take him out to Maysmore or whatever, and is then, here's your conveyance, sir, and they bring him a really spirited horse. We're so lucky today, there's always a taxi rank outside the station. After much argument, in 1847, they finally decided that a freight branch could be built into the docks, and it followed the line of the tramway into the docks. The standard gauge Midland entered the docks in 1847. The Great Western would enter a bit later. The line from London had now opened, in broad gauge terms, right through into the heart of Cheltenham. And for a very short while, the express trains forgot Gloucester, steamed straight through and went to Cheltenham, stopping at what they called the Tea Station. And there, which is the Morrison site in the Railway Triangle now, the Gloucester carriages would be detached from the wonderful broad gauge express, turned on a small turntable, and they would be pulled into Gloucester Station behind a horse. You imagine you've steamed all the way out of London over Maidenhead Bridge, down the Stroud Valleys and everything, then you arrive in Gloucester behind a horse. Magnificent. And that was the Tea Station. It lasted until the 1950s, just a little transfer station, and then it was taken down on the site by the main line. It was sad, but that it lasted for 4 years. It went in 1851 when the new line opened from the Forest. So for a while you had broad gauge, standard gauge, all operating in the same area. Gradually the Midland extended its 4 foot 8.5 lines, and the broad gauge would eventually disappear. But the next line in came from the Forest, and they decided they would build a new Great Western railway station separate from the Midland. So now Gloucester had a through line. The important one from London would run straight through, whereas the north-south line would run into the Midland station, and if you wanted to carry on to Bristol, the train would come back out again and then go south round a new loop railway through Tuffley and down to the south, into Gloucester, back out again backwards and then down, which is pretty well what happens today. So we don't progress that fast, do we? And you can sort of look at that bit of history by the buildings which are still there today. The station hotel opposite the bus station is there, and it's on the maps here with the railway running through. So that's the old Midland station, pretty well opposite where the station hotel is today. The second station, the new Brunel Great Western Station with the lines coming in from South Wales, was a massive affair. Brunel liked to have all these trains on one long platform. It was one of the longest platforms in the country. The little Midland station is just hiding out the back here in the back of the Great Western Station. So that lasted for a while and then it was cut back. But of course today, with the changes to the stations, you again got that huge long sweeping platform, and it must look today a bit like it did in Brunel's time. That end of the platform was added after the Midland Railway had gone from Gloucester. So 3 of our lines were broad gauge, 7 foot wide. Turner celebrated that in his famous painting of the Great Western Railway coming out of London. In Gloucester, Barrett's, the photographers in George Street, managed to do a deal with the railway company whereby trains could be backed down outside the back window of Barrett's shop in George Street, so the photographer could take pictures out of his bathroom window of the broad gauge expresses, and there's a whole range of these wonderful pictures. London Road in the background. These were the trains that worked through Gloucester in the 1850s through to the 1870s. The whole idea of travel worried people. Punch has a running commentary on railway journeys. This is a lady discovering that maybe she should have insured her life. She had never thought she was going to be doing anything dangerous when she went on a train. And then somebody rings a bell in her ear. The bell was the signifier that the train will be leaving within the next 5 minutes. Punch again. The young man is telling the old man the horrors of railway travel. Why, just the other day the boiler blew up on an express train and people died. The actual detail of the carriages is wonderful. You see their top hats hanging up on special cords from the top of the railway carriage. Punch and others followed the birth of railways, and especially the accidents that actually introduced safety to the railways, with awful rhymes. And Gloucester people were actually involved in one of the early accidents in Sunning Cutting near Reading on Christmas Eve, I think it was. People coming back from London, workmen who'd been working on the new Houses of Parliament, rebuilding it after a fire there, coming back to Gloucestershire, travelling 3rd class, leaving London at about 4 o'clock in the morning in the dark, hit a landslip in Sunning Cutting, and the freight bit of the train that was behind them concertinaed into the carriages they were in, and 13 people died. The Great Western Railway shortly afterwards said that they had a wonderful safety record and they'd never killed anybody in 1st or 2nd class. 3rd class wasn't mentioned. The broad gauge lasted for a long time. It lasted through to 1873 in Gloucestershire it was replaced, and the last bits were done over a weekend, so that the whole of the railway in Gloucestershire became standard gauge. The last broad gauge trains actually left London in the 1890s down to the southwest peninsula. So broad gauge didn't die overnight when Parliament changed the rules. They let it linger on where it didn't meet other lines. In Gloucestershire, that was pushed forward and it all changed. So let's look at the other station, the Midland railway station, Eastgate station. So the original Midland station was the one near the railway hotel, near the bus station. Gradually the Midland changed its focus onto the curve south through Tuffley, and in the 1890s they finally built themselves a brand new railway station which came really off the end of as it were Eastgate Street, coming down from the centre of the city. The Great Western and the Midland were joined by a long walkway across all the tracks, so you could actually get from one station to the other by foot. It was again a fairly humble station, Eastgate, fairly low, and it was the most sensible station in many ways in Gloucester from a north-south point of view, because the trains from Birmingham to Bristol could come straight in and then go straight on south again without all this backwards and forwards that had been happening before. And Eastgate, here's Gloucester Park, and the main line curving south, and of course there was the branch round the park and down to the docks. In the background you've got the Great Western running through. That was the walkway between the two stations. You can imagine people being tugged by their earlobes from one station to the other, trying to catch the train to Western for a day out at the beach. The Midland Railway dominated on that route, smaller express trains, and then in British Rail days you'd get the south-west traffic coming down through Eastgate, freight traffic coming to the docks. And for a while Eastgate station actually became the main line from Gloucester to London, because again you could come from Cheltenham straight through Eastgate station down to the south, up through the Stroud valleys and off to London, no backwards and forwards. But the decision was taken in 1975 to shut it down, largely because of the road crossings in Gloucester through Tuffley. There were several roads with crossings on them, and that was holding traffic up, they decided. So the lines were removed, Eastgate station disappeared, and the Asda in Gloucester is built pretty well on that site. If you stood on the platform at Eastgate looking south to Barton Gates and the church there at the end of Barton Street, and if you look there today, that would be pretty well the same view. The end of the church, the signal box used to hang out over and the lines went straight on through down in that direction. Everybody remembers Barton Gates, everybody of a certain age anyway, being held up while trains shunted backwards and forwards, or long expresses drew out of the station and went down south off towards Tuffley. The long argued about docks branch curved round through the park and came down to the canal side near Foster's Oil Mills and down where the shopping centres now are. If you'd crossed over Bristol Road, you'd have been going over the traffic gates here and looking into that yard, Fielding and Platt there, and the wagon works on the other side. and a wonderful wet day with all that horrible smoke and smuts filling the atmosphere. These days it's shops. So this was where the company had built that dock for coking back in the old days. All that got filled in and the marshalling yards filled the space. The wagon works, huge Gloucester engineering business producing carriages and wagons for all over the country, all over the world in the long run, Fielding and Platt, and the branch through into the docks themselves. And virtually every building in the docks was linked to the railways. The lines ran between the warehouses, across the lock, across Lantony Bridge. On this side the broad gauge came in, and there were a few mixed gauge rails which you could run either on. To the north end of the docks, the Midland Railway here being shunted in with horses rather than locomotives, because the locomotives were too heavy to go over some of the weaker bits of the system. So they'd bring the wagons right through into the docks. At the other end you've got the broad gauge wagons coming through from the line that crossed Olney Island. And Lantony Bridge must have been an amazing sight if you were going along Lantony Road to find one of these things coming in the opposite direction. The swing bridge was modified to take the railway, rebuilt to take the railway, and that linked the Midland and the, by now, after 1873, standard gauge Great Western. And the industrial lines of Gloucester spread out either side of the canal, linking through the carriage and wagon works and down into the timber yards. On the other side you eventually get the power station with its lines coming in, and you've got the lines that go down towards Hempstead. At Hempstead itself there was a Midland line which came past the old gasworks there and through the timber yards and crossed the canal on a swivelling bridge which had its own little signal box. That wasn't much used and it went out of use in the 1930s. That line would curve round and come back on the western side of the docks, round the back of timber ponds where they used to keep the timber wet. And this is a First World War view with all the wagons all going off to France built in Gloucester, waiting for trains to take them. And that's the lines running round the back of the docks. Coming in from the forest side, you've got the old route of the A40 climbing up to go out over Telford's Over Bridge. The main line of the railway comes in and runs through to Gloucester Station. This branch crossed Olney Island and went into big marshalling yards where goods for the canal were sorted out, and later a lot of coal came through into for Gloucester's power station down on Castle Meads. Being Olney Island, from time to time it all went underwater. This is the 1947 floods, and this is the fireless locomotive which served the gasworks down there, ran off the steam pressure created and put into the boiler. It didn't have a fire itself, as in a normal steam engine. That's preserved and it's waiting now, I think, to go on display down at the Vale of Berkeley Railway. So coming in from Wales, again in 1947, crossing the line of the river, this is the Black Bridge. The pumps here used to lift water out of the river and pump it up to the engine sheds at Gloucester for the boiler water for the engines. That is still there. The old boating lake used to be down here, but in 1947, of course, it's all gone underwater, as has quite a deal of Gloucester. So the line came across Archdeacon Meadows and through into the station as we know it today. Eastgate is down at the bottom. And that's pretty well been the centre of Great Western Railway operations in Gloucester for all time. The old station had, as a very significant feature, that signal box high up above the tracks looking either way, because Gloucester was a great place for trains coming in from Hereford and from the valleys. It was a great mixing point. It was a great place for train spotters to come. Lots of people used to come to Gloucester because it was a stronghold of steam. Here it's decked overall, I think, for probably the coronation back in the early 1950s. It was replaced by the architectural marvel that is Gloucester Railway Station today. And of course, a lot of the action we've been talking about with the early Midland Railway was happening here in the car park. That's the Horton Road crossing, where you've got the Bristol line coming up and crossing over, the Birmingham line coming and crossing over, all on the railway crossing. And of course, once upon a time, you'd also have had horse-drawn tramway wagons wending their way right across the middle of that picture. The crossing's still there, it's still a nuisance to people in Gloucester, but it's much smaller these days. The signal box used to stand there, and behind it was the line of the tramway curving off to Cheltenham. These days, everything's been simplified, the signal box is gone. Horton Road is still there, and you still have to wait for ages as trains cross backwards and forwards. Looking again out from the top of the gasometer on Horton Road, looking to the railway triangle, these were the old Midland Railway sheds where their locomotives were looked after and serviced. The Great Western ones were serviced behind, again from Horton Road. Gradually, the railway shrank. Eastgate disappeared, and the railway triangle for years just sat and mouldered. And various people had plans. They said, well, all this business of Gloucester, we started off back in the 1840s with trains from Birmingham coming into Gloucester and then having to go out backwards before they went on south. And here we are in the 1960s and 70s, and all the trains that want to go to Bristol from Birmingham that are going to call at Gloucester have to come into Gloucester and go out backwards again. We don't seem to have got very far. Why can't we put a new railway station on the triangle on the north-south line so that Gloucester can have a new railway station? But of course, that was never looked at. It's been brought back several times, but now of course we've got much better. We've got a new supermarket instead, which is much nicer. The only trouble with the Morrisons there is that they didn't build the cafe, so you can actually sit in it and look at the railway trains, but never mind. Gloucester Railway Station is still there, still serving the various lines. It's been modernised, it's got improved lifts and things like that, so everybody can get from one platform to another, and it still offers a decent service. It's pure accident that it arrived there because of a decision in the Houses of Parliament back in the 1830s as the bills were first looked at. What had been proposed for Gloucester way back by Captain Morsam, who was the engineer for the Birmingham line, was that Gloucester would get a freight line into the docks and a passenger line that would cut through the middle of town and serve a new station. If you'd have stood in Southgate Street and had that line been built, you'd have had a totally different view. On arches through it would have come the line from Birmingham, and that would have travelled through to Gloucester Blackfriars railway station. Who knows what damage that would have done architecturally. And it would have ended there, high up, as Phil Moss has drawn it, outside Blackfriars. Here's Isambard Kingdom Brunel looking cross down in the corner because he hasn't had the chance to build his line. And Gloucester Blackfriars, well, how long would it have lasted as a very small railway station high up on an elevated section? But it shows, I think, just how much the draw of the docks was back in those early days of the railways, when people were thinking, how do we start to link places together? I hope that has given you some ideas. You can certainly walk around and see a lot of where this railway infrastructure was. There are little bits of rails all over the docks if you care to look for them. Gloucester has a long railway history and part of the national history. Thank you.